ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another podcast of the 16th Council. I'm Ishan Jasuja, as you know by now, and we are recording this at a very tumultuous point for geopolitics. The United Nations General Assembly is in session with the Sustainable Development Goals for the 2030 agenda being a big part of that conversation. Now, too often, the Sustainable Development Goals are treated as a compliance tax by companies and a box-ticking exercise by governments. Today, we attempt to flip that script by asking how governance can drive growth in frontier markets and emerging markets by propelling employment, exports, and value addition. And for that, we have been joined by a very special guest, Mr. Matthew Anderson. Sir, could you please introduce yourself before we begin?
Hi, I'm Matthew Anderson. I am based in London and I run an education consultancy that deals with developing markets, at the moment primarily Africa, but also in Central Asia and Central and South America as well. I also chair the Francophone British Business Council and the Mauritania Britain Business Council, which give me an insight across all trade in Africa, particularly Francophone Africa. The reason I did this is because these are countries that are more or less overlooked by trade in the UK. A good example of this is a lot of British business work in Nigeria and Ghana, but they do not work in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, there's opportunities in these countries. There's a lack of, as we say, a colonial history or familiarity or shared history with the countries. That's what seems to stop people wanting to engage. So it's my job to bring British industry into these countries in Africa, but also in my day job, provide education and skills training projects to mainly Africa. One of the key things of this is we align everything we do with the Sustainable Development Goals. So obviously, there are ones related not just to education itself, but to the jobs, the good quality employment and things outside of that, which is all underpinned by the education side of things. So that's what I do. I spend a lot of time in Africa. I'm heading to Algeria in a couple of days, and I regularly go to Mauritania, Senegal, and other countries in that area. So while not being African, I'm starting to think like it now because I spend so much time there.
Well, so who better to give us these insights, right? What has been your experience with the Sustainable Development Goals? As we understand, only 17% of the SDGs are on track, meaning that most of them will not really be achieved by 2030 as originally imagined. But what's the situation on the ground in the countries that you've been talking about?
I think, quite honestly, around this, the SDGs were developed, they were adopted. Everyone thinks they're a good idea. However, they're designed by committee, so there's some watering down. But also, then I think the thing with this is that when everybody goes away and produces the colourful chart that you see of all the SDGs, there's a tendency to forget about it. And I would say it is very rarely mentioned as a driver of trade, particularly I'm talking more on trade because I'm not really involved in any of the humanitarian areas, but in terms of trade, it's very little is mentioned about the SDGs. However, my company, we track everything we do against an SDG in terms of education and the like. And one of the things that we do is we train people and then we use recruitment agencies in order to employ them and things. So we pin ourselves to the SDGs, or we justify everything we do against an SDG. But I would say if I talk to a government in Africa about this sort of thing, it would tend to be, yes, great, you're working with the SDGs, that's great. So I think on a national level, the country's signed up to it. I would say there's a definite, they forget about it. Once they've done it, they've signed up to it, they forget about it. But then somebody comes along like me with a project that meets them, they react favorably to that because I'm helping them to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there's also an element to this, not just in the governments, but I think there's an element of bringing the international companies that are investing in Africa to this as well. And one of the things that we do is we work with mining companies, energy companies, let's say large companies that are investing in Africa, whether it could be in logistics, port logistics, that type of thing. And I think it tallies nicely with the SDGs, the local content rules and laws that they have in some of these countries. So, for example, in Senegal, there is a law around local content. So every investor in the country has to either employ a certain percentage or train a certain percentage or commit a certain percentage financially or in terms of impact to local population. So from our point of view, we always position this as it's your local content obligation. And of course, what we do is then pinned to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. The local content obligation, of course, is as basic as if you're taking a resource, a mineral, energy, oil from a country, you may be listed on the London Stock Exchange or New York or whatever, and you're making a profit, you owe the people of the country that you've taken from, not the governments and the ministers and the officials and the companies within that country that benefit, but the average general people in that, the guy that, if you're in Africa that's selling you the phone card credit on the street or whatever, you've got to do something for the people. You can't take the resources and go. So that's how we position this. So SDGs and local content requirements. Some countries, of course, don't have a law about this. They just ask very nicely that this happens, and depending on the companies, they will participate with us in this. So yeah, I guess that's it. The SDGs they're not top of everybody's daily thinking. However, they're certainly there and present, and everybody knows that a couple of years before 2030 they're going to be panicking to try and fulfill them. So better that we help them now.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that you speak to a variety of governments, of course. Do they realize in your conversations that is there a straight line between SDG compliance and economic growth, or do they have to design deliberate policies that involve employment creation, or, as you mentioned, value addition?
I would say one of the things, particularly if we're talking about Africa, is that in all politics globally, there's a short-term thinking because it's about the maximum benefits right now. Longer-term views tend not to be considered as highly, and certainly something like the SDGs, which are with a 2030 deadline, not a problem to be considered now. Now, there is certainly an understanding that, let's say, investment in skills now will create prosperity for people further down the line. And I'll give you an example of Mauritania. About 10 years ago, we were engaged by the Mauritanian government to set up an English university, which we did. And from that point, there's been several thousand people have gone through this university. They're now fluent in English. When I arrived there 10 years ago, English speakers were very rare, so I had to speak French. But now, English speaking amongst the younger people it's not only is there a significant cohort of people in the workforce now that can speak English, but it's become an aspirational thing for everybody else to join in and learn English. So I set up a training centre there a couple of years ago as well, which is now teaching English privately to people. So it's a very, very clear example that within a decade, an investment, a significant investment, not a massive investment, but the building of an institution, the opening of, and the engaging of a foreign partner to run it, has absolutely provided dividends for the country. And we would suggest that that's the case across all educational areas. In Mauritania, they discovered gas, and they've now started finally to extract the gas. BP are working in the country now, but there were no, should we say, no skills related to these industries. So now there are things like health and safety, engineering, dealing with ports, transportation of dangerous goods, that type of thing, because they were unable to employ local people because they didn't have the skills. So we've been involved in projects that have upskilled local people so they have international qualifications and can participate, hopefully, in their local labour market, working with the international companies. But also, should they wish to move country, they would have qualifications that were seen everywhere. So 100%, you invest in skills, you will reap the benefit. Now, that also is in the skills, the prosperity of the people, particularly if they're now in the formal workforce as opposed to perhaps the informal workforce, results in taxes, that results in more money for the government, which the government can then invest in more skills, which will then result in more taxes. So you have a cycle of skills development, a cycle of uplift for the country in terms of what it's doing. So obviously in my job, I'm a very big believer in, if you put the building blocks in place and put the skills in place and give people the opportunities, then there will be a benefit. Politically, it doesn't necessarily result in an instant impact, but over a few years it does. So oddly enough, some of the countries that I've been working in Africa that have, should we say, election cycles that the West might not approve of, you might get better results because you really do know who the president is going to be in 5 years, possibly 10 years. Whereas somebody who's hanging on to power by a few votes is not going to invest in something that's 5 years, 10 years down the line, just in case they want instant results. So you have to think of the economic impact versus the political interest versus the way that the cultures and the business environment and the political environment operate.
I understand. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned investment because speaking about sustainable development goals, signing policies does not really cost a lot of money. However, implementing those policies costs a lot of money, political will, and a lot of other things that emerging markets and frontier markets oftentimes do not have. I mean, they face an investment gap of around $4 trillion per year when it comes to the sustainable development goals. How do they bridge that gap? Where will that money come from? Can Western enterprises help?
It's a big question, and it's one that could have a fairly simple answer, but also the implementation of that is very hard indeed. In my education role and in the role chairing the business councils, I've come across, should we just call them Western investors, let's say, who are interested in investing in certain countries, but because they're private investors, because they're not familiar, because they're not donors, the lack of understanding means that they're not taken seriously, or, this sounds a bit hard, we're not going to do this. The countries, I would say traditionally, they've got their money from some of the bilateral or multilateral development banks. African Development Bank in particular, I think, is in a particularly good place because of the election of the new president, Sidi Uttar, a man who knows what he's doing when it comes to this, and he's able to mobilize capital from the Middle East as well as the traditional sort of Western governments. But some of the countries, they've relied on, if I need to build something, or if I need to do something, or create something, or develop my infrastructure, whether that's infrastructure of the country or whether it's infrastructure of the people in terms of skills, knowledge, they would go to one of these banks, ask for it, it would be delivered or not, or particularly in some of them would perhaps have donor funds. I mean, I've seen huge evidence across Africa over the last sort of 20 years or so that Saudi Arabia would fund this, UAE would fund this, Qatar, depending on the country, depending on the culture, whatever, that funding would come from those sort of sources. So the mindset is the established multilateral or bilateral banks or donor funds. Now, COVID-19 has severely stretched a lot of these bilateral or multilateral funders, certainly. What now really needs to happen is private investment to come in. And there are, people talk about PPP, public-private partnership, but it's got about 100 different meanings depending on who you talk to. So it's difficult to really hone down on what that means. But, for example, in London, there are trillions of dollars that's looking for a home, as long as it can be protected, guaranteed, that type of thing, particularly on the sort of, should we say, green finance, ESG, that type of thing now. Would certainly look at, a country where you could build educational facilities and the government could pay that back at a commercial rate, or even sometimes you can get lower than commercial rates for this. But the problem you have is around the guaranteeing the funds, state guarantees. If I'm honest, the state guarantee from a country that's had a history of coups, it's not really what the sort of more sophisticated, should we say, Western investor is looking for. But using international bank guarantees, using other means of guarantee, these are new ideas and they're going to take some time, I guess, in order to embed. And of course, don't forget, in a lot of these places, there are people who are going abroad, learning in America or UK or Europe, and they're coming back with new ideas into the ministries and things. So the situation is improving, but part of the problem I'm seeing in terms of mobilizing the funds is the capability, I would say, in country of the government, so the investment promotion agencies. They're simply looking at either PPP or they're looking as a new Western model, but they're not looking at more adventurous ways. As I said, there's money in Frankfurt, there's money in Luxembourg, there's money in London, there's money in New York for this sort of thing. And if it can be guaranteed and structured properly, it could help. So that's certainly my experience of seeing this. Things like the African Development Bank have, there are serious liquidity problems, and they're now going to have to rebuild what they're doing. I think they've got the right man in charge now, as we know him from his time in Mauritania and running Badea Bank. So, as far as I'm concerned, there needs to be a willingness to look at new ways. There's no shortage of money. It's just how it's accessed, how it's guaranteed, how it's repaid, and how the investors are protected. But I would say more than half of the money now going around London now requires some sort of green wrapper, ESG, something like that. So it's about how the countries are receiving this as an idea.
I understand. And I think that can be applied to SDGs as a whole, right? Because if you're a policymaker in this country and you view the SDGs as something that you need to make lackluster policy statements about, or have another thing that you have to report to the United Nations, another sentence to add in your UNGA speech, rather than look at it as a vehicle to actually do value addition, to increase business opportunities in the country itself. And speaking of business opportunities, we've spoken about SDGs from a government's perspective. Let's transition now to an investor's or a business perspective that wants to invest in a frontier market, right? So if you are such an investor, how will you tell apart a true business opportunity in that country versus the ESG green wrapping and the greenwashing that we've been talking about?
I think on this, I would say the SDGs themselves, they're not one of the most important decision-making processes in this. Now, certainly around ESG, because that's become the buzzword, again, I would be surprised if you asked people, you would get a consistent definition of what this is. It means different things to different people. So let's just say, ESG as a this is money that's doing good, as opposed to selling arms or developing weaponry or something. So financing that goes to something that has a social good, let's say, or an environmental good. I don't think the SDGs come into many people's thoughts when it comes to that. It's nice to have. It's something that they can look back on afterwards and say, well, okay, this matches SDG, but I don't think it comes in as a primary driver. I think what I'm trying to say in all this, the things like the United Nations will come up with these. They're designed by a committee. They're implemented. Everybody thinks they're a great idea. People talk about them. Our government talks about them, but then we forget about them. So I would say it's on the list of things that have been considered by investors from various countries. The SDG element is not a serious or significant part of it, but it's actually this fits, so we can claim this. You think in terms of things like local content, a lot of it is around box ticking. So if I can fund this, let's say, biodiversity resort in a part of Africa which will have sustainable tourism, I'm doing that because I'm going to make money. However, if somebody says then to me, oh, actually, that fits with SDG, whatever number about either education or jobs or that type of thing, or inclusion of women, whatever it is, then I'm going to be like, yes, it does, right? That's going in my marketing materials. It's not a major part of my decision making. I might be wrong. I might just be talking from my experience, but on a practical day-to-day, here is some money I'm lending to a project where I expect a return. It's nice to have a bonus, I would say.
Right. And it's good that you mentioned the everyday challenges, because that is the crux of the issue I would like to get at now. Because as you mentioned, SDG policies, etc., are discussed in these air-conditioned meeting halls in the UN in New York. Are Africa's everyday problems really represented in those spaces? Because, well, let's take online connectivity, for example. We are recording this on Zoom. In our parts of the world, we often take the internet for granted. But, well, a lot of people in Africa only 38% has access to the internet, for instance. Can the SDGs provide a platform for policymakers or businesses to cooperate and solve these challenges? Or do you think that lack of representation or not enough attention to these problems will lead to them just being confined to discourse?
Um, hmm. I'm going to sound like an awful capitalist now, but I think these projects are going to be sorted by innovation, entrepreneurial behavior. Okay, you've mentioned internet. What's the most famous internet provider around the world at the moment? Probably Starlink. It's not to mention Elon Musk's name around these things, but there is a product that can genuinely help the communities that you're talking about. It's not terrifically expensive these days, and obviously requires licenses in certain countries. But I know people who've got it in Africa now who they're trying it out. But take that particular product aside, there are products like that are the ones that are going to help Africa. You look at places like Nigeria, which has now got a thriving fintech community. And again, I'm very skeptical that things like the United Nations are going to make any material difference. Okay, it's big, it's policy level, it's talking, but it's still people sat in a room discussing other people's problems, but from a point of view like a sort of paternalistic, let's help them, well, Nigeria's fintech industry is helping itself. Something like Starlink is going to, if people are adopting something like that, they will be helping themselves. Solar power projects in rural places, that type of thing, battery storage for this, but people are helping themselves through entrepreneurship and the like. You can't ignore the UN, and I don't want to do it down, but I don't think they're going to be the driver of how Africa develops. I was just thinking about this actually the other day. I had a conversation with a minister of finance from somewhere in southern Africa. I won't name it because I think she's still in post. But it was around the lines of, we have to borrow money in dollars from, we go to Washington and beg for money to help us develop something that's going to improve our country. Then whatever happens with the financial resource of the world, we then have to repay that. 9 times out of 10, it will be an American, Western, whatever company coming in, doing the work. So you borrow 100 million, 80 million of that goes back to some country that's supplying the services, and then the benefit is left behind. So there's a feeling, I think, that the old system, the way of this, is probably not how it needs to be. So, borrowing money in dollars from around the world, then engaging Western consultants or EPCs to build these things, and then paying that money back to them, then owing that money forever. You have the benefits of the resource, whatever it is, the bridge, the road, whatever, but it's not a great look when you're doing that. I suppose you call it African agency now, that, hang on, we're going to need to sort this out ourselves. We're going to need to innovate ourselves. And I think the free trade zone that they've brought in now there's a long way to go on that before it's effective. And then when it becomes effective, you look at like the European Union, and how effective is it? I think Africa's going to have to fix Africa's problems. I think the UN, I don't think that's, the Sustainable Development Goals are great. It was good to get everybody together thinking about what needs to happen, but the development that's required is not going to happen in a building in Washington. It's going to happen on the ground in Africa.
Right. And I think you've highlighted a big challenge here in this conversation, because we're talking about sustainability, and you mentioned the high debt burdens in Africa. Are they really sustainable? Especially if you're a commodity dependent country for your exports and your income. What do you do with these high debt burdens, right? Because you owe the money, that's not coming down, but your income is quite volatile depending on what the commodity markets are doing. So what's the way to circumnavigate this? I ask this question because there's a big conversation about debt sustainability in Europe, and now with the UN meeting as well, that's going to be a topic that's on top of the agenda.
It's probably the biggest problem that most of these countries face. They're drowning in debt. The greater part of their budget is going on debt repayment for things that they've had or haven't had the benefit of. Then they're spending on their education and their healthcare. And this has to stop. There was a huge debt forgiveness program, 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. And as soon as that happened, the debt's just been built up again. Now, different types of debt. Some are good, some are bad, some are controversial, some are less controversial. But the thing that the West has got very exercised about in recent years has been the Chinese investment in Africa. Now, what they've done in most of these cases, they've come in, it's all very obscure how it's done, who's benefiting, that type of thing. But they come in, a railway is built, a road is built, a bridge is built, something is developed, something happens. There is then a debt to China. China has done a lot to become friendly with Africa in recent times with the FOCAC summits. That they're looking to invest. Yes, of course, China is doing it because it can access the resources, mineral resource, critical minerals, that type of thing. It also does it on a part of the payback is for their own diplomatic requirements. So, there are certain, obviously, issues in the world that China does not want the United Nations voting against it on. So it's built up a block of as many as it can of the 54 African nations who will never vote against China for obvious reasons. So in terms of repayment, though, and debt forgiveness, yeah, that's an issue. However, where I have a problem with the sort of Western and being British as well, you look at some of the money that's been lent, and what's happened is, like, we will lend you this money for this particular thing, but you need to have free and fair democratic elections, or your social system needs to try and mirror ours, and then we'll lend you some money and things. And I think this is where China has come in, and just they've been able to reject the West. Now, who are we in Europe, America, whatever, to go into a country? I was going to name one then, but I won't, and say, you need to change your electoral system. You need me to be less this. You need to be less corrupt. Who are you? You just come in. Now the Chinese will come in, and again, it's not just the Chinese now. I mean, you're in India. India has invested a huge amount in Africa recently. So there was an Indonesia-Africa trade conference. So Singapore, Japan, they're all present. The West has this obsession with we must have a democratic, fair process, but that's how our society has grown up. These are alien concepts in a lot of countries. So the Chinese fits a lot better in terms of, well, I am the president. I don't want to give away huge freedoms or huge whatever in return for a bridge or a railway or whatever, because the Chinese will do it, no questions asked. So in terms of the debt, there are debt burdens all over the place in different. So Africa owes money to all corners of the world and for different ways and different technicalities around it, and it is unsustainable. I know I've been doing some work with Zambia recently, and Zambia sort of defaulted some years ago. Now it's on a good path at the moment back to sort of, but it's still debt. The debt is one of the major government spendings, and there needs to be a way to, whether it's repackaging the debt, whether it's repurposing non-performing loan, stretching it out, or whether it's, I suppose it's undesirable, but if you give us so much oil, gas, diamonds, whatever, over a period of time, we can reduce your debt income. You can then spend it on education, healthcare, social programs, infrastructure development, things that will drag the country up to the developed world status.
Yes, I smiled when you mentioned the BR because that's what my master's dissertation was at King's. And we have an entire podcast at the 16th Council on China's involvement with Africa and how it's a double-edged sword. So that was a very interesting insight from your personal experience in these countries. But we've been talking about how local businesses can get more involved in this, right? Because if you're a micro, small, or medium enterprise in Africa, how do you become more involved in your own economy so that the country itself does not really have to depend so much on external sources of finance? And I ask this now because in India, we are having this push for vocal for local, essentially buying Indian made merchandise or small artisanal goods, etc., to boost the MSME sector within the country. How can Africa do something like that for its own economy? And do you think African MSMEs can become more involved?
I think the tide's changing on this. Certainly, if you look at some of the foundations, philanthropists, that type of thing, there's a lot more startup incubator type things, prizes for the best ideas, things like that. It's not at scale yet, but there are more and more mechanisms now for young people in these countries who've got great ideas, who are connected to the world by internet. 20, 30 years ago, someone growing up in Nigeria would not, unless they had the radio, they wouldn't be necessarily aware of what was happening around the world. Now, everyone knows what's happening in Silicon Valley. Everyone knows what China is doing. The world's become very small, and people want to do that. They have idea. Just because you're in Angola doesn't mean that you're not as smart and switched on as somebody in California or something. So these people, they just need an outlet to do it. And I've noticed this a lot. I don't think it's necessarily the complete answer to this, but I've noticed various foundations, philanthropic institutions, business people who will set up some startup funding. And I think when I'm in conferences or meetings and things in London, particularly around somewhere like Nigeria, you keep hearing this, the tech sector, or how it is. You keep hearing, the great inventions that are there. There are unicorns coming out of Nigeria and things like that now. So it's possible, and it's getting better. And I think that other investors that see this will say, okay, we'll have a look at this. We'll look at investment in this Nigerian tech startup or this Kenyan mobile money payment service or this. So there'll be trendsetters within finance who'll look at it, and it will get eventually over time. But there's no quick fix to this, but it is definitely improving.
Right. So going forward, we've been talking about all of these things, and it's become amply clear that goals simply will not solve the problem. We need to ensure last mile delivery of SDGs, because governance is what's going to actually solve the problem. So as we've been saying, it's the 80th anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly, UN80. There's a lot of conversation about a lot of change that needs to occur within the organization itself to make it more effective. Going forward, how do you think international organizations such as the UN, regional organizations, and multilateral development banks, what can they do? What can they change to make SDGs more impactful for MSMEs in Africa and emerging markets in general?
Oh, wow. That's a difficult one. I know this isn't the answer that you're looking for, but I would say I don't think that they're the people to do it. I think it is the innovative finance. I think it is the new thinking, the changing attitudes. I don't think you're going to get a different response from the UN than you have in recent years. You may get some panic as it gets towards 2030. It's not being achieved. Now, the multilateral banks, it's not. It's going to come from innovative finance that helps things to develop. So, for example, I work with financial services people who are they're interested in this, but they don't do things that governments or whoever expect or how it's always been done. So therefore, as I mentioned at the start, they face resistance to what they're trying to do, what they're prepared to do, offering to do. There's a resistance to what they're doing because it's just not how we've done it. The UN sort of represents how we've always done it. And so unless they're behind sort of debt cancellation or whatever in order to free up some of the national budgets to encourage this, things like the UK government, the American government, they're not going to be the answer to this. The UN, they're not going to be the answer to this. It's got to be, I think it's going to be entrepreneurial driven and innovative finance. Because if people know or realize they can make money by doing these things, then it will happen. The private sector will take over and do this. If it's, sort of controlled by a big government body or a big global body, in all of these, there are vested interests, there are committees, there's bureaucracy, they just don't move fast enough. And I think the SDGs, they're a great rallying point. They're a great thing. And as I've said, I use them in validating what we do, but also as if somebody says, what do you do? Well, I do education projects and they're related to SDGs. They're great on that level. But the innovation of finance that I can find in order to do some of these projects, it will never happen. As I say, I'm very, very positive about what's going to happen with the African Development Bank now under the new leadership, because they're going to change a lot. But I still don't see that someone like me being able to go necessarily to the African Development Bank and say, okay, I'm going to build some smart schools in Burkina Faso or something like that, and it's going to take 100 million. Can you lend me that money now? And I'll do this, and this will be the impact. Without 18 months, 2 years of writing papers and bidding and committees and things like that, it's just not going to happen. Whereas if I find, an investor, a sovereign wealth fund, an institutional investor that's looking into this, a philanthropist even, a family office, who are, okay, we believe in this, go for it. That's where the change is going to come from. I just don't see it coming from these big, bureaucratic, monolithic institutions.
No, that's a very good point. And I think that mirrors the sentiment that people really have around these big organizations. They're slow, they're bureaucratic. Oftentimes, they don't have representation. The African people do not have representation in these bodies because the narratives and discourse are dominated so strongly by the developed well-to-do economies of the world. So I think really the answer to this, and we've been talking about this a lot at the council also, is organic growth driven by the people of the country itself. And if they can find funding elsewhere in the institutions that they've mentioned, I think that's going to be a really impactful combination. And it also serves as an opportunity for regional bodies to step up, the African Free Trade Area, the Africa Development Bank, etc. So going forward, there's a lot of opportunity. We've spoken about some risks, and thank you for taking the time today to really outline and help us develop a blueprint, if you will, from the buzzwords that we hear so often that are often empty words and that really does not have on-ground impact. And that's what we've been trying to change. So I hope the audience has had as much fun listening to this as much as I've had talking to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Some great thought-provoking conversation. Thank you very much.